I am Jason Ur. I'm the director of Harvard Center for Geographic Analysis and also the Harvard PI for our NSF IUCRC project. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Lee Schwartz. Dr. Schwartz is the director, he is the geographer, a wonderful title, of the Department of State and the director of the Office of the Geographer. He's been in this position for 10 years. He's the department's 9th geographer, and this is a position that's been in existence since 1921 and is responsible for providing guidance to all federal agencies on questions of international boundaries and sovereignty claims. So at the Department of State, he's directed research and analysis on global issues primarily related to humanitarian issues. He's coordinated related research and fieldwork overseas, particularly in the Balkans, Central Asia, Russia, the Middle East, East Africa, the Horn of Africa. It's a long list. And getting longer. Most recently, his work has focused on ethnic conflict, refugee flows, peacekeeping operations, strategic warning and conflict mitigation and response, with an emphasis on geographic information systems and remote sensing information coordination. And for his work, he was recognized in 2005 as the State Department's winner of the Warren Christopher Award for Outstanding Achievement in Global Affairs. So with that, let me introduce Dr. Lee Schwartz.
Thank you very much. It's always enjoy coming back up here. A lot of friends in the Boston area. I've been working on a lot with many people here on a number of issues for many years. So I'd like to thank Harvard and also the NSF Spatiotemporal Innovation Center for inviting and hosting me today. And I'd also like to welcome our colleagues, I think some of whom are here from are they here from the People's Republic of China? A couple of whom I met in New York last week. Anybody still here? Was that yesterday?
Yeah, in fact, Professor Guo is not here.
And Peng De Li was...
He left this morning.
Okay. But I apologize I wasn't able to come up here yesterday and listen to what appeared to be a really outstanding lineup of speakers and topics. Is this on? Do I need it on? It's on. So the post-lunch time slot is usually one where people tend to be a bit drowsy, so I'm going to try my best to keep your attention. I've got a lot of graphics. I toyed without having any slides, and then I think I went the opposite extreme, and once I started putting slides together, I got so excited over sharing some of the work we do, mostly so I can try to tap you for some of the ideas you may have to make our work more effective, that I've got quite a number of maps primarily that I'll be barraging with you today, but I'm trying to end early so we'll have a little bit of time for questions or comments. My position at the State Department is rather unique since I don't think many other governments have a geographer that's attached to their foreign ministry in an official capacity to provide guidance to policymakers on geographic matters. So that is the reason why I chose for my title of the talk today, Translating Science into Policy, because that is, in essence, what I do and what the very talented cartographers and geographers who work for me do every day. But we do this almost entirely via the use of hard copy static maps. Sometimes these maps are included in order to complement a written analysis. Sometimes they're standalone and often rather elegant infographics. Sometimes they serve as large reference maps for negotiations over boundaries, ceasefire zones, refugee flows, or disaster prevalence. My office does produce some interactive products, an occasional time series animation, a few computational models here and there, some targeted digital flyover capabilities, and some software-enabled code that enables us to view potential boundary changes during diplomatic negotiations. But by and large, we don't do spatiotemporal computing, which is why at first I was a bit uncomfortable in giving a keynote in front of a gathering of expert academics, practitioners, and scientists who do computational geospatial analysis. But when I was looking over the papers and participants, I came to view this more as an opportunity to look to you all for some help in doing my job, since so many of the issues being covered in this symposium are very much in line with those that my office works on. Can I get the slide up here so I can have a look at it? Somebody can figure out how to hit something here. Print screen, I don't want to mess anything up. Anyway, you can see all the issues that we work on. The office was changed from the Office of the Geographer to the Office of Global Issues when Tim Wirth was named the first Undersecretary for Global Affairs at the Department of State. And so the global issues we work on are issues that are defined as transboundary issues. When the State Department changed from having a purely regional focus to more of a functional focus in terms of the issues it covered, they needed somewhere to place all of the analysis that took place under that category, and they kind of threw everything into the Office of the Geographer. So a lot of these transboundary issues like refugee flows and peacekeeping and human rights and women's issues and climate change and environmental sustainability and urbanization and a whole series of issues, many of which are ideal for time series spatial temporal analysis, and many of which were part and parcel of the papers that were given previously in this meeting, are the types of issues that our office focuses on. Now I can see it, but you can't.
Great.
So you go back to the toggle. Wait. I'm trying to take this and turn it on and use this to advance the slides.
All right.
Sorry about that. I couldn't make it work. Yeah, help is on the way.
Here we go.
We couldn't.
That's good.
Oh,
I think it's good. Yep, that'll work. So you can see the issues that we covered. If you look at the issues that were covered, as I was glancing through the program, many of them are the same. Just very briefly, I feel obligated to tell you a little bit about how the office is organized, because most people don't know that the office even exists, no less how we're organized. We have an analytical division that does basically intelligence analysis for our policymakers, and we have the historic guts of the office, the Geographic Information Unit that does cartography and imagery analysis, is also responsible for boundary expertise and geographic names as well. And about 10 years ago, we formed the Humanitarian Information Unit, primarily because our office was doing a lot of work on disaster response, complex emergency mitigation and response, humanitarian crises, refugee flows, often where we couldn't get into the areas. We had to do a remote analysis before we figured out logistics of relief supplies for both natural disasters and man-made conflict crises. And we realized that the U.S. government was stovepiping a lot of its information. A lot of it sat in classified sources. We needed a way to move it out of these sources and share it with the UN and NGO world. And we created the Humanitarian Information Unit as an unclassified interagency fulcrum, if you will, to deal with disaster information, largely in a visualization format, focusing on good data standards and metadata and georeferencing and all the things you need in order to share information over a broad array of actors, both government and non-government. So the Humanitarian Information Unit has as its motto, information is our middle name. And I'd like to cite my friend Joe Kursky from Esri, who calls information as the nervous system of the earth. The Humanitarian Information Unit works on a very transparent and open relationships of trust with a whole host of organizations. We don't have MOUs. I always feel that if you have a memorandum of understanding with an organization, that means fundamentally you don't understand them. So we try to avoid that. We try to make sure that we're just as transparent as possible with any information we can have and we can share. So in doing research a little bit in preparation for this talk, I realized I wasn't going to talk about spatiotemporal computing because I don't know much about spatiotemporal computing. But I did do a little bit of digging around, and I found this document that was written for the Federal Geographic Data Commission in December 2016 called Emerging Technologies and the Geospatial Landscape. And it spoke about technologies impacting federal agency geospatial activities. And since the State Department is a federal agency, I took a look at these, and I posited some of the recommendations in this report as the challenges to this community here, you all, in terms of the work that you might do that can help the type of work that I do at the State Department to try to transmit the science of spatiotemporal geospatial computing to policymakers who have to make intelligent, science-based decisions every day. So obviously, I think these will not be unfamiliar to all of you. Data collection and generation, whether it's real-time spatiotemporal data or past data or future data because of modeling that we can do, with the increasing availability of pervasive surveillance and participation. We have ever more data sets resulting in big data that presents even new analytical challenges. We have to consider not only the 3 V's of volume, variety, and velocity, but also of value. We have the challenge of visualization. I put down one-click customers. It's because I can't tell you how many times people come to the State Department hawking their latest product or their software, their data analysis, and they take me to a website, and they click here, and they click there, and they click over here, and they say, stop it. You've lost my customer at the second click. All right? We can't tell people if they want information, just go to the website or go to the blog post or bring in some shapefiles. So we have the challenge of still a customer base that's used to having a one picture that tells all, a map. And I keep waiting for the day when we'll have this supposed young generation of technologically sophisticated policymakers that don't want that, and I've been waiting for a long time. We need to take more advantage of bottom-up versus top-down approaches, and we need to make sure our data are available and open and free as much as possible. The whole idea of authoritative data troubles me some because I've had a lot of data sets that are provided by governments or official sources or contractors who are contracted to various different government agencies that are put forward as authoritative data, and many of these data sets are quite bad. So I think it's most important that we have good data, whether it's big data or authoritative data or whatever data, free or open or purchased. The goal should be the best data possible. So if someone is and the challenge of that also is let's see what I got here. I'm having trouble here. I've got low disk space message here. Anyway, I've got.
Let's see this resume slideshow. Let's try this. Try now.
By the way, the what's that?
It's not moving?
No. There we go. Oh. The fifth bullet in that list is the government needs to develop a workforce that is more capable, and I've made it a point over the past 10 years to try to professionalize my office so that we have professional geographers working there, but more importantly, we have analysts who can both use the tools of our trade and also do good, solid analysis. So the office used to have international relations analysts and then cartographers and imagery analysts very separate. Now I'm trying to have a workforce that has competencies in both. So I threw a couple of cartoons in here. This was just an article I read in the Washington Post last week by Tom Friedman, which I thought was pertinent for this group. And here's what we don't do. These are all the types of visualizations that are part of spatial temporal computing, and we do some of these, very modest ones. Here's just an example of something we did in Horn of Africa, something we did in Haiti following the earthquake, some real-time work from the field during crises with very poor communication and threatening environments. But at the end of the day, as I said earlier, we rely on traditional maps that are rooted in the present or real-time spatiotemporal analysis. We deal in data-poor environments. I'm constantly getting, I used to always get people come and again, display products in my office, taking advantage of data from, let's just say San Diego. And I've got to do the same thing for northern Mali. And it's quite a different challenge set. So you need to also know your customer. Obviously, this is sort of cartography 100. And you need to design your products for different customers. They need to be visually compelling. And what we say in this human geography data working group that I'm the co-chair of, our data need to be useful, usable, and used. And you know, the communication in all this is the key to our effectiveness. And that's where I think spatiotemporal analysis really has a leg up on static maps. You can tell a story. You can use your map to tell a story over time, or you can use your animations to show change over time and space. And I think that's at the very heart of spatiotemporal analysis. My friend Chris Tucker, who's on the American Geographical Society Council with me, has a map site that he's developed called Map Story, which does a whole series of presentations that trace change over time and place, I think, rather elegantly. The American Geographical Society also has a new series of conferences or symposium it puts on every fall called Geography 2050, where we're trying to look far into the future. We chose the date 2050 because probably none of us will be around by then, so we can be bold in our predictions and not be held accountable. But one of the challenges we're having in that group is it's very hard to get people to think that far in advance. They can think 100 years in advance if you're doing a climate change model. They can try to predict 2 years in advance, but trying to go in that in-between time is actually very tricky. You have to sort of suspend your science, if you will, and use your imagination more. In fact, at this next Geography 2050, we're going to have a session dedicated to science fiction writers, because that's the group that can really, step out of their imbued knowledge base and think more creatively. If you look back, most science fiction has predicted most things. I mean, not in one book, but in the volume of literature. So anyway, it's communication is important, and being able to know the time frame that you need to communicate this to our policymakers. I'm dealing in a situation where people want to know what's going to happen tomorrow. So it's very different, which is one reason why we don't make use of a lot of these tools that are available to us. So let's see what I got here. So I'm going to give you here's an idea of the type of work we do. So rather than going into spatiotemporal computing that we don't do, we put out a map every month that shows change in ISIS areas of control. We do a lot of classified products as well that you're obviously not seeing here, but these are the types of work we do that would benefit from being able to more elegantly automate the data, put it into a very simple animation mode, and provide analytics that will actually tell something about the change in the areas of control. I borrowed this from Dan Sui, who I think very nicely shows how scale is changing drastically in terms of the type of information that we can get even from sensors. Where it used to be that we were satisfied if we had things by the county, and then it became the census block, and then it became the household, and pretty soon it's going to be the bedroom. We're going inside the house, and so I have this has always been a bit frustrating to me because I've never met a geographer who was satisfied with the level of scale that they had. I think that's that's one of the beauties of our discipline here, that we always want to dig deeper, because if we can disaggregate data, we can understand patterns better. And so this is my slide for the challenge of big data. All right, we want to try to get the best available data. But in doing so, I think we have to be very careful, because often the best available data ends up being bad data. And I think what we rush to do a lot of times is nobody likes to have empty spaces on a map. And so, because that doesn't look good, to fill in the empty spaces, we use the best available data, even when we know that the data are bad. Sometimes we'll say, well, nobody has any better data, or nobody has made a better estimate. So if we're trying to understand the tribal distribution in Yemen, and we know we have a census in the British archives from the 1950s that was bad when it was produced then, and then we extrapolate it now into current boundaries, and then we smooth it out into new administrative units that have been created, and all of a sudden we produce a map and we say this is the ethnic tribal distribution in Yemen, and then we say, well, nobody has anything better, then we're doing a disservice when we're using some of these sophisticated tools when we're starting with bad data to begin with. All right? I'm sorry, I don't need to be lectury here to this group. And an example of something in my office that we did is when we got bombed, unexploded ordnance data from the Israeli Defense Forces following its war in Lebanon in the mid-2000s, 2007 I think it was, and we put a buffer around each piece of unexploded ordnance and calculated the amount of agricultural land it would take out of production and extrapolated into the next growing season. And we came up with an assessment of how this would impact the agriculture in southern Lebanon. And one of the people who worked in my humanitarian information unit happened to be Lebanese and had a relative who lived in this area who went and said, nobody's taking any land out of agricultural production. If any of you have ever been to a crisis zone, they don't put yellow police tape around an unexploded ordnance and not farm it. They pick it up, or they lose a cow or a goat, and they farm the land. But so I guess what I'm saying here is that whenever possible, obviously ground truth is important. Boundaries is the essence of a lot of the work I do, and the problem with boundaries is a lot of times we're trapped by data that are collected along boundaries when the actual event doesn't pay attention to boundaries. So we have a series of analyses we do called conflict without borders. Most conflicts creep over national borders, over ethnic or tribal borders, and the data are often collected at the edge of the unit that people have permission to work in, or the government they're working with. Somebody collects information on the other side. They do it according to different standards. Again, this is not something that is new to you all. We do the same. There are many of these things. It's conflict. It's infectious diseases. They don't pay attention to the units that we use for collecting data. And the famine in the Lake Chad region right now is indicative of this. 4 different countries, all with potential famine. It's not yet famine. But the whole idea of how do we get data in remote areas in different countries with different standards and different administrations. Same thing for electoral geography. It's a nightmare when the units change over time. Like Nepal and Burma and places like that. This would be a tremendous value to have some automated techniques for a lot of these administrative boundaries that change, and the populations and the voting patterns can be predicted based on these constantly changing boundaries. And I know some of you here have worked on these very challenges. Again, we have the same thing in Burma. They recently changed their election rules and their administrative boundaries, and comparing one election one year to the next election is very tricky. Then it would also be nice to be able to use artificial intelligence to show where boundaries are physically changing, such as the Rio Grande River between the U.S. and Mexico, which meanders, or the boundary in the Shatt al-Arab between Iran and Iraq, which is defined as the Thalweg, or the deepest navigable channel between the two countries, which, because of the silting of the river, changes, which could potentially change the boundary between these two governments, which would potentially change in the huge amount of area that would be available 200 nautical miles out into the exclusive economic zone. Same thing with a lot of the boundary negotiations we're doing with flyover technologies, with 3D capabilities, where we can determine where, for instance, we've done some projects where we had the Army Corps of Engineers working with us, where if you used a flat map, you might draw a boundary that would go over a canyon and require millions of dollars to build a bridge, where if we just moved half a kilometer, would solve that problem. But once you put a line on a hard map, it's very difficult to change it. I find that GIS analysis is much easier. It doesn't have as much of a sense of permanence, and we've used it very effectively in boundary negotiations. I'm not doing an animation here. We have a laptop we've put together for the Middle East peace process, which calculates not only the square kilometers that shifts between the West Bank and Israel when exchanges are made in the seam zone barrier and in potential transportation corridors, but also attaches a value to that land, because if it's just a square kilometer for square kilometer exchange, you could potentially exchange valuable land for poor land. There needs to be some sort of a metric associated with that. Of course, ultimately, that metric has to come from the parties themselves and not from a third party like the U.S. government. But on the fly now, every time there's a change in the boundary, it also calculates the value of the land in terms of what value it might have for agricultural, transportation, defense, and so on. Of course, climate change, critical. It relates to, as everyone here knows, energy and transportation and geopolitics in the polar regions, but also we're very interested in a lot of the pollution that can be monitored in terms of transboundary pollutants. How do we measure CO2 emissions in one country that cross a boundary into another country? And there are plume measurements, there's remote sensing types of measurements that can be done, but we haven't really tackled that challenge for coming up with a scientific way to have a systematic, agreed upon calculation of emissions for each country. It's much like with boundaries, with the continental shelf boundaries that are submitted to the UN Conference on the Law of the Sea. Each government comes up with its own science and applies it and submits it. South China Sea, we're working an awful lot in. There are some techniques now using LiDAR where you can actually measure whether a feature is underwater or above water at the 17-year mean high tide, which is what is required to make it an island as opposed to just an underwater feature. And some of these technologies can, I'm told, be accurate within 3 centimeters through turbidity. And these are unclassified information that can be made available. If the governments could agree upon using a science-based means for determining what constitutes, according to the law of the sea, an underwater feature, a rock, or an island. Obviously, a very important geopolitical issue in the South China Sea these days. We're playing around with using crowdsourcing and mental maps for neighborhood definitions in a place like Aleppo here, where incidents are reported based on neighborhoods, and there is no neighborhood map for Aleppo. How do you determine a boundary of a neighborhood? You can do it by cultural features, or you can do it by having people's mental maps. The refugees will just sketch the edge of their neighborhoods. You get 100 of them, you normalize the boundaries, you come up with a neighborhood map. I mean, I can't tell you where my own neighborhood begins and ends, and most people have an idea of the neighborhood, but it's different than an actual administrative feature. But a lot of information is often reported based on a neighborhood. So this was sort of a watershed, I think, in terms of a natural disaster that started us down the whole road of big data. And for the Indian Ocean tsunami, my view is that this was a big failure in understanding the magnitude of the relief effort and the population that had to be reached, because in large part this was the type of a signature that you saw from the tsunami. Very often a thin area along a coast. Census data are not organized that way. You had tourist areas, you have fishermen and women, very few women in this area. You had just a very narrow band of land, so there was no way of estimating the populations that were potentially affected. And that, I think, was the beginning of a lot of these efforts that, that this morning's talk, Lisa? Lisa was laying out very nicely in terms of all the different efforts being made by Columbia CSIN and World Pop and Oak Ridge to try to estimate ambient populations, to know where anybody is at any point in time. And this, I think, is a huge area for this spatio-temporal group to work about. And I think everybody is probably aware of the crowdsourced famous map from Haiti after the earthquake hit there, all the data that were crowdsourced and developed following that crisis, where the volunteer geographic community was galvanized really for the first time with large amounts of free and open commercial satellite imagery that was made available to them. And then we had similar events. And you can see how this has changed just in a short, less than a decade. The number of volunteer mappers, the amount of imagery made available, the number of edits made on a map. Oh, you're not seeing it? Sorry. I was seeing it. Yeah, I'll just delete it. So the volume of information made available. Our office does a lot of work on human rights monitoring, some of which has been done through imagery and sensors that are picking up burning villages like in Darfur. We've done a lot of work on before and after imagery analysis that led to a project that we developed on a refugee atlas of the Darfur crisis. Secretary of State Powell came to us at the time and said there's a lot of press reports about horrible things happening to defenseless women and children, but I don't need yet another press report. I need to substantiate that it meets the criteria for a war crime or genocide, which requires it to be systematic, targeted against a specific group, with the intent to remove that group from the land. And so he asked his geographers to put together a project that could map out from refugee interviews the changing level of violence that would show that it was not random, that it had to be directed and indeed met the burden of proof to declare a genocide. And we put together this book called Documenting Atrocities in Darfur, which led to Secretary Powell making a genocide declaration in front of Congress. So there's a whole idea of accountability for human rights. Our office is the executive agent for sharing information for the war crimes tribunals from the U.S. government. And we find that while imagery is very visceral for press reports and for public diplomacy, if you have an image of a mass grave before and after, say, that it doesn't really help in a trial. It's not a gotcha minute for identifying a perpetrator. That in those circumstances, what we found was if you could link the location of these mass graves with the identification of particular military units that were in the area and map their movement through time to show that it wasn't just coincidental, that every time a particular commander moved to a certain area, we had evidence of a mass grave. Then you could present that in a map, and it's actually more compelling evidence in a war crimes trial. Of course, that was a hugely labor-intensive and research effort, and the types of sensors that are available to us now would make something like that possible via artificial intelligence and via automated techniques and via sort of persistent surveillance of actually catching people in the act, and to be more of a detriment than some of the efforts that occurred at that time. Some more work we did, again, through refugees that could be done through persistent satellite surveillance. These are the types of things we put together all the time through intensive, going through, thousands of pages of documents and hundreds of pieces of imagery. I put this photo here because I had the opportunity to take a barge up the Nile River from Juba to Bor, where the Dinka were repatriating from Democratic Republic of Congo. Coincidentally, I met a person I had worked with who was working for IOM in Sarajevo, who now is working for IOM in Juba when the capital was first moved there in South Sudan. And the challenge that nobody was paying attention to at the time were these refugees fled violence 20 years earlier with 2 or 3 heads of cattle. They were coming back now with large families and hundreds of head of cattle. They were coming back to land where there were no land tenure rights. There were other people living on the land, often from a different tribe, different ethnic group. And so anybody who, I think, understood this situation could very much understand that South Sudan was going to run into some problems. And there's a lot of work that can be done on, I think, on land tenure issues, desertification issues, the whole crisis throughout the African continent between pastoralists and agriculturalists. I think there's a rich amount of work that could be done through visual spatiotemporal analysis. Same thing with refugee mapping. This is the type of maps we do on refugees all the time. And in the European refugee crisis, we came out. Oh, I hadn't. Jeez. I'm way behind.
Do you have your screen extended so that it's going to multiple screens?
We tried that. Which one are you?
There's some nice pictures.
See where it says resume slideshow?
Oh, yeah.
Hit that. Now it should be responsive.
Running on 7.
I'll leave this to you.
That's why we had it, so it was just not.
What's that?
I think the reason why it was not mirroring before is because this computer doesn't have the power to mirror it and play it at the same time.
Oh, well, then we don't have to mirror it. I don't need this. Other issues we work on. Wildlife trafficking now. We're trying to work on disrupting illicit networks and the convergence of wildlife trafficking with arms smuggling, with drug smuggling, with human trafficking. That's an area I think that would benefit by computational analysis. All right, I'll show you. Burning villages for human rights monitoring. This is the refugee survey I spoke about in Darfur. We put together this paper for Secretary of State Powell. This is the picture I took from the barge going up the river. This is an example of a typical refugee map that we produce every day. The type of map we produce each week. Very labor intensive. It will be a lot handier if we could get the data collected more systematically, more consistently, and to be able to do more analysis over time as opposed to put out these snapshots, which then would require somebody to go in and dig deep into the data to understand the patterns. Wildlife trafficking, I just mentioned, and convergence with other criminal activity and with violence that's occurring in the region. This was important to link wildlife trafficking with militia activity in order to make the U.S. government understand that this was something that was a security issue and not just an issue that was of concern to the wildlife in Africa. Again, these are examples of things, maps that would benefit from your expertise to tell us how to do this type of work better. IUU fishing, I know, is one of the topics that was raised here at the conference. Illegal fishing, not only identifying where the boats that the illegal fishing activity might be occurring, but identifying where the fish stocks are moving with climate change. HIV/AIDS, we're doing a lot of mapping, a lot of crowdsource mapping, a lot of participatory GIS, identifying vulnerable populations, identifying gaps in the mapping that would benefit by a more robust computational analysis in areas where we do have good data sets now. PEPFAR program, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief in Africa, has a tremendous data set that we're not analyzing as effectively as we could. More example of our HIV/AIDS mapping. We run mapathons. I think all of you are probably familiar with these by now. And we've run a lot with our PEPFAR program. Some metrics on that in terms of the number of people involved, the number of edits that are contributing to that. And one of my favorite slides that those of you who have seen me speak before are probably getting tired of. The way I like to present my work that I've been trying to do on human geography, I'm trying to push being able to map features that are not necessarily observable from space, social, cultural, religious data, how to map it more effectively across time and space, more consistently throughout different agencies and governments, so that we can compare a lot of these data that are related to some features that are inherently unmappable. So I say we need a satellite for human geography, and that satellite, I didn't want this to be animated. The satellite for human geography really is participatory mapping from the bottom up. And so we're trying to promote a lot of these efforts. One of them is a project that we have called MapGive, which is based on the imagery to the crowd technology that we helped to develop, which has now become commonplace for imagery to be served out by OpenStreetMap and others. We can trace imagery and have vectors come be digitally part of OpenStreetMap. Some of the projects we've worked on over the years. I like to put that this is the way we can manage the crowd. If we post imagery that isn't available except through the purchase that the U.S. government makes and makes available to the crowd, and if we align it in a matrix of squares that once they're mapped can no longer be mapped by someone else, and they have to go through 100 squares in order to complete the project, then it makes sure that we don't have just people working in the key crisis area like they did in Haiti when this was first popularized, but it completes the entire region that we want to get information on. Trying to get through. There's our website, and we also have a project called Secondary Cities, which we're going to be probably talking about in the next session that our office also manages. We're trying to map most of the world's urban growth is taking place not in the mega cities, which have been the subject of a lot of scrutiny in the past decade, but in cities that are not as well mapped, that sometimes have unaccounted for growth, that aren't documented in census, that are vulnerable to natural disasters, that are in conflict areas, that don't have goods and services provided to them, that have environmental risks, and so on. And we have 10 projects currently underway. All right. Oh, I ended with the cartoon also. So my final message, or the message I think I've been trying to give throughout, or maybe it was understood, is that I think the scientific community needs to be able to translate its message better to the policy community. And I think we're not doing as good a job as we could be doing. I ran a conference out in Boulder at NCAR a couple of years ago, and it was on climate change. And for one of the sessions, we told the climate scientists, the modelers, that they couldn't talk models, and we told the geographers that they couldn't talk maps, and they couldn't have a conversation. So if we can't speak in, I think, clear language that's understandable to people who are making critical decisions about many of these issues, then I think then we're losing the value of capturing capturing our science. So that's the final challenge I lead you with. So thank you very much.
So we are, thanks to technical difficulties, we're running a little bit late, but I think it would be a crime not to give.
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had to. That's my bad. I could have gone through it faster. Sorry.
Well, we can have a few questions for Dr. Schwartz.
That's one way to pick up time.
Thank you for your talk, Lee. You mentioned that you wish there was faster ways to bring the data in so you could spend more time analyzing it than mapping these snapshots. What would you say is the biggest obstacle to that for the State Department? Is it just the source of the data is so heterogeneous, or is it their workflow pipelines, or is it is it staffing? What is it?
No, I think the biggest problem is that nobody wants it. I think if our senior policymakers had an appetite for that type of analysis, then we would staff it and get the right talent and get the right data sets and the right tools to do it. But I think we haven't come up with an effective way of translating that to a policymaker. So look at most of the presentations you see at a professional conference where we're presenting our models and presenting our tools and even writing up what we're doing. It's in a language that's unintelligible to somebody who's trying to make a decision about what to do in a foreign policy community. So I think we still have a big gap between how we're doing our analysis and how that's translated to a very busy policymaker who wants answers, not sort of more questions.
Hi. So I had some people working for me at one point who were making some maps for some State Department teams, and they were very insistent on, we make one of these maps. We're going to use this in this negotiation, and it's really important that, what we work goes onto this map and it doesn't go anywhere else. And so is there a way to translate that sort of, one map truth into looking at analysis more broadly?
Well, I'm not sure you're getting the complete picture from whoever was making these maps, because what happens is they want one map, and then they call you and they want to change, and you make the change, and then they call you half an hour later from overseas in the middle of the night or on a weekend, whatever, and you have to make another change, and that's how it tends to work. We have had people go out when negotiations reach a certain point. We have GIS specialists go out there and actually work on the fly with them. But more often than not, it's the back and forth, very inefficient way of doing business, in large part because people are afraid to put a paper map in front of somebody. Unless it seems pretty much what they're comfortable with doing, once they get something out in a paper product, if it's not exactly right, or if it shows too many options, there can be a downside to that. So that's a challenge. Thank you.
Well, let's move on to our panel session. Oh,
I'm sorry, sorry to inject a question actually from one of our researchers here from the School of Public Health. The question wasn't directly to you, but to our center, but I think that you are probably the best person to answer it, so I can't help but. Her question is that the Soviet Union at its time, was it grouped into Europe, or was it considered its own region? She's doing a spatial analysis and looking at boundaries, historical boundaries, and couldn't find any referenceable source.
There is none. The State Department does not make any distinction as to what constitutes Europe and what constitutes Asia. We break down our countries according to our policy bureaus, but that's not related to any geographical global reality. So whether you consider Europe, the European boundary, the Ural Mountains, or the Russian-Ukrainian border, or whatever, the State Department doesn't have a position on this.
I see. Thank you.
okay. Well, thank you again, Dr. Schwartz.
All right, thank you.
I'd like to invite the panelists for our fourth mini panel to step forward. This section will be chaired by Robert Stewart.
Here, that's the chair's seat.